In a forgotten village perched precariously on the edge of a dense, whispering forest, where the wind carried echoes of things long buried beneath root and stone, this story began. Clara lived here, a woman with hair like midnight, thick and untamed, and eyes that held the depth of a storm gray. Wild and restless, as if they'd glimpsed truths no one else dared to see, she tended a small herb garden behind her cottage, a crooked wooden structure with a sagging roof, her hands perpetually stained with earth, her days quiet and solitary, marked only by the rhythm of seasons and the hum of bees among her flowers. The villagers whispered about her, called her a healer when their children burned with fever and her poultices cooled their skin, a recluse when she shunned their festivals and chatter, and a witch when the moon hung low, casting strange shadows through her windows that danced without a source. Clara paid them no mind. Her world contained within the boundaries of her garden and the memories of her grandmother, a bent figure with gnarled hands who had raised her after her parents vanished into the forest one winter, never to return. She had grown up on tales of love that defied the shadows. Stories her grandmother told by the firelight, tales of lovers bound by fate across lifetimes, of hearts that burned brighter than fear or death, of promises kept even when the world turned to ash. Those stories had planted a fragile hope in Clara, a belief that such a love might one day find her. Pierced the solitude that clung to her like damp moss on the cottage walls. That hope, brittle and untested, flickered to life when Thomas arrived. It was the dead of winter, the air brittle with frost, the ground hard as iron, when he came, a stranger with a weathered coat patched at the elbows, a scarf wound tight against the cold, and a voice that rumbled like distant thunder rolling over the hills. He knocked on her door one night, half frozen, his breath a cloud in the dark, his knuckles red and raw, seeking shelter from a blizzard that howled through the trees like a living thing. Rattling shutters and burying pads in white, Clara hesitated, her hand hovering over the latch, her grandmother's warnings about strangers echoing in her mind. But something in his shivering form, his slumped shoulders, the desperation in his shadowed eyes softened her. She let him in, warmed him by her hearth with blankets and a bowl of broth steaming with herbs, and as the snow piled high outside, sealing the world in an icy shroud, they talked. Thomas spoke of a life on the road, of towns he's left behind with names she'd never heard, of a restlessness he couldn't shake, a hunger for something he couldn't name, something that drove him from place to place like a leaf caught in a storm. His presence filled her small world, rough-edged yet magnetic, a contrast to the stillness she'd always known. And Clara, against her better judgment, felt her heart stir. A quiet ache she hadn't known was there. Their bond brewed through the frozen months, slow and tentative at first, like frost creeping across a window pane, then fierce as the thaw approached, a fire that burned hotter with each passing day. Thomas stayed, claiming the storm had trapped him, though the roads cleared weeks before, the ice melting into muddy streams that carved paths through the village. He helped her with the garden, his callous hands brushing hers as they pulled roots from the soil, burdock for cleansing, nettles for strength, his laughter warming the air when she taught him their names, his voice rough but gentle as he repeated them. At night, they sat by the fire, sharing silences that felt alive. The crackle of logs acquiesced him to their growing closeness, the glow painting their faces in golden shadow. Clara began to love him, his quiet strength, the way he'd linger by her side long after the work was done, the way he looked at her as if she were the only light in his shadowed life, a beacon he'd stumbled upon after years of wandering. He told her he felt the same, his voice low and earnest, cutting through the winter's chill, that he'd roamed for years through cities that stank of coal, through fields that stretched endless under gray skies, but had never known peace until he found her. Until he stepped into her world and felt the weight of his past lift. She believed him, letting her guard fall, giving him her trust, her secrets. Even the old tales her grandmother swore were true tales of spirits that lingered in the forest, restless and vengeful, their voices woven into the wind, of deals made with things unseen that demanded blood or soul in return, pacts that left the unwise hollowed out and lost. Thomas listened, his eyes glinting in the firelight, a strange hunger in them she mistook for curiosity. A spark that flared when she spoke of her grandmother's journal, a leather-bound relic on her shelf, its pages yellowed and filled with cryptic runes, herbal recipes and warnings inked in a trembling hand. He'd ask about it, his tone light, and she'd smile. saying it was just old folklore, a keepsake from a woman who'd seen too much. He promised he'd never leave her side, his hand finding hers, his grip firm, and Clara clung to the vow, letting it anchor her against the doubts that gnawed at her edges. Spring thought the village, softening the earth and coaxing green from the ground, and with it came whispers. The villagers noticed Thomas lingering, saw the way he watched Clara not with love some said, but with calculation, his gaze lingering too long on her cottage, her garden, her solitude, and a few warned her to beware. Old Widow Marek, whose hands shook as she clutched her cane, told Clara she'd seen men like him before, men who took and left ashes behind, their smiles masks for greed. The butcher's wife, a stout woman with a sharp tongue, muttered that Thomas asked too many questions about the forest, about the old stories. His interest took him for a drifter. Clara dismissed them, blinded by love, certain they were wrong. Their words just jealous mutterings from folk who'd never known what she felt. But love, as the forest knew, could hide sharper edges. And the trees seemed to lean closer, their branches creaking, listening to a rhythm only they understood. Summer arrived, heavy with heat and the drone of cicadas, a thick haze settling over the village, and Thomas changed. The restlessness he once buried resurfaced, gnawing at him like a fever that wouldn't break. He paced the cottage at night, his boots scuffing the wooden floor, leaving faint trails of dirt, his gaze drifting to the trees beyond her window, dark and endless, their branches swaying without whine, as if beckoning. Clara asked what troubled him, her voice soft with worry, her hand reaching for his, but he brushed her off, saying it was nothing, just old habits stirring. A wondrous itch he couldn't scratch. His tone clipped where it had once been warm. She tried to hold on to him, cooking meals with herbs she'd grown, lavender for calm, rosemary for memory, thyme for courage, weaving him a scarf from wool she'd dyed herself, its deep green a match for the forest he seemed drawn to. Her fingers trembling as she worked the loom, she'd catch him staring at the journal more often now, his fingers tracing its spine when he thought she wasn't looking, his questions about it sharper, insistent. What did the runes mean? What power did they hold? Were the stories real? She laughed it off, unease prickling her skin, saying it was just a memento. Nothing more, but the warmth between them faded, replaced by a distance she couldn't bridge, a coldness that seeped into her bones. One evening, as the sun bled red across the sky, she found him in the garden, kneeling by her herbs, his hands digging into the soil, not to help, but to search, his breath quick, his eyes darting. She asked what he was doing, her voice trembling, and he stood abruptly, brushing dirt from his palms, muttering about a lost tool, his smile forced, his excuse thin. Doubt crept into her then, a shadow she couldn't shake. But she buried it, clinging to the love she'd built in her mind. Then, one morning, she woke to a silence that pressed against her chest, heavy and wrong. Thomas was gone, his coat was missing, his boots no longer by the door, the hearth cold where embers should have glowed. On the table lay a note in his jagged scrawl, the ink smudged as if written in haste he couldn't stay. The village suffocated him. He'd never meant to hurt her, an apology that felt hollow, like wine through bare branches, a lie scrawled to ease his own guilt. Clara's heart cracked as she read it, the paper crumpling in her fist, but the pain deepened when she saw the empty spot on her shelf. Her grandmother's journal, the book of spells and secrets, was gone too, its absence a wound deeper than his words. She tore through the cottage, the garden, even the village square, calling his name into the stillness, her voice breaking. But Thomas had vanished, leaving no trace but the ache in her chest and the echo of his footsteps fading into the forest. A peddler passing through days later brought worse news. He'd seen Thomas in a town miles away, laughing with a woman named Lillian, her arms draped in silks Clara could never afford, her hair a cascade of gold that caught the sun, her laughter sharp and mocking. The peddler said Thomas bragged about a book he's taken, one worth a fortune to the right buyer. Some shadowy figure he's met at a crossroads under a waning moon, his voice thick with greed as he counted coins. Clara understood, the pieces falling into place like stones in a grave. He'd used her, wormed his way into her heart with calculated tenderness, stolen her love and her heritage, the journal her grandmother had guarded with her life, and left her broken for another, for a life of riches she'd never see. The villagers shook their heads, muttering she should have known, their pity a bitter sting that fueled her rage. But Clara didn't weep. Something darker took root in her, a fury that pulsed like a heartbeat, raw and unrelenting, a need for vengeance that the forest seemed to hear, its leaves rustling in a rhythm that matched her anger, its shadows deepening as if to welcome her. She turned to the shadows she'd once feared, the ones her grandmother had warned her against with trembling hands and whispered prayers. Clara remembered the tales of the forest's hunger, of spirits older than the village, older than the mountains that loomed in the distance. Entities born of primal wrath and endless want, granting wishes for a price no mortal could bear, blood, soul, or something worse. She'd laughed at those stories as a child, hiding her giggles behind her hands, but now they were her only weapon, a lifeline in the abyss of her betrayal. That night, under a moonless sky so black it swallowed the stars, she walked into the trees, her bare feet sinking into moss that felt too cold, too alive, its texture slick and pulsing faintly beneath her soles, her breath fogging in the unnatural chill that wrapped around her like a shroud. She carried a knife with a bone handle, its blade chipped but sharp, a lock of her own hair tied with twine she'd soaked in salt water, and a vial of blood from a rabbit she'd killed at dusk, its warmth still lingering in the glass, its death a quiet offering she'd made with shaking hands. The forest watched her, its silence heavy, broken only by the snap of twigs underfoot, the rustle of leaves that moved against the wind, and the distant howl of something that wasn't a wolf, too low, too guttural, a sound that clawed at her nerves. She pushed deeper. Past gnarled trees whose bark twisted into faces frozen in silent screams, past streams that ran black under the starless sky, until the air grew thick and the ground pulsed faintly, a heartbeat not her own. There she found it, a circle of stones, blackened as if scorched by a fire that burned centuries ago. Their surfaces etched with runes that seemed to writhe when she looked too long, glowing faintly with a sickly green light. She knelt, her knees pressing into the damp earth, her skirt soaking through, and recited words from memory, harsh guttural words her grandmother had forbidden her to speak. Words that tasted of iron and ash on her tongue, that scratched her throat as they spilled out. She cut the lock of hair with the knife, letting it fall into the center of the circle, poured the rabbit's blood over it, the reds dark against the dark stones, and pressed her palm to the ground, feeling it tremble beneath her. The air split with a shriek, the wind tearing at her hair, whipping it across her face, and the ground groaned, a low resonant sound that vibrated in her bones. A presence answered. It had no form, only a voice that slithered through her mind, cold and sharp as ice, cutting into her thoughts like a blade, its tone layered with malice and amusement. Clara offered her bargain, Thomas's betrayal repaid, his soul dragged to ruin, his life snuffed out in terror. His screams a payment for her pain, in exchange for whatever the spirit demanded, her blood, her years, her peace. She didn't care. The voice laughed, a sound like breaking bones and grinding stone, a cacophony that made her teeth ache, and agreed, its words a promise and a threat. It told her to wait, to watch, and when the time came she'd know what to do. Instinct would guide her, it said, its tone mocking. A mark burned onto her wrist, a jagged rune that glowed red like molten iron, then settled into a black scar, pulsing with a life of its own. A tether she could feel in her marrow. The forest fell silent, the air stilling, the stones dimming, and Clara stumbled home, her legs weak, her heart a tangle of dread and resolve, knowing she'd crossed a line from which there was no return, a threshold marked by the rune's searing heat and the whisper of her own name on the wind. Weeks passed, slow and oppressive, the village sinking into a haze of unease that mirrored her own. Whispers reached her like tendrils of fog, carried by traders and wanderers who paused at the village, well, tales of a man and a woman found dead in a distant town. Their bodies twisted into unnatural shapes, limbs bent backward, their faces frozen in terror, mouths open as if screaming at something unseen, their eyes clouded white. Clara knew it wasn't Thomas, not yet. The spirit was toying with her, testing her patience. Its presence a shadow at the edge of her vision, a cold breath on her neck when she turned too quickly. She waited, tending her garden by day, though the plants began to wilt, their leaves curling inward, yellowing despite her care, their roots blackened when she dug them up. By night, she stared into the forest, the rune on her wrist throbbing like a second pulse, a rhythm that sensed with the rustling trees. She dreamed of Thomas, his face pale and pleading, his hands reaching for her through a fog, only to dissolve into smoke. his voice calling her name until it warped into a scream. The village grew restless. Dogs barked at nothing, their hackles raised. Children woke crying of shadows in their rooms, tall and thin with too many arms, and the elders muttered about a curse stirring, their fingers tracing signs against evil as they huddled in the chapel. Clara felt the shift, the air heavier, the days shorter, the forest creeping closer, its edges blurring into the village fields. Her sleep grew fractured, her dreams invaded by the spirit's voice, whispering riddles and threats promising pain beyond Thomas' death, a death that stretched into eternity. Then, one stormy evening, as thunder rolled over the hills and rain lashed the cottage, a letter arrived. It was from Thomas, slipped under her door by some unseen hand. The paper sodden, written in a trembling scrawl that smudged with rain and sweat. He begged her forgiveness, said he'd made a mistake, that Lillian had tricked him into selling the journal for a handful of gold that turned to ash in his pockets, that he was coming back to her. Desperate to escape what followed him, something he couldn't name, something that watched from the dark. Clara read it and smiled, a cold, hollow smile that didn't reach her eyes, her fingers tightening until the paper tore. She burned the letter in her heart, the flames licking the paper as if eager to consume his lies, the smoke curling upward like a promise, thick and acrid, staining her eyes. The next night he appeared. Thomas staggered into the village, a ghost of the man he'd been, soaked and wild-eyed, his coat torn to ribbons, his skin pale as death, streaked with mud and something darker, blood perhaps, or the mark of whatever chased him. He pounded on her door, his fists leaving smears on the wood, his voice hoarse as he pleaded to be let in, claiming something was hunting him. Something he'd seen in the woods, claws and eyes, and a hunger that wouldn't stop, a shadow that moved too fast, too wrong. Clara opened the door, her face a mask of calm, her hand steady despite the storm in her chest, and let him collapse by the fire, his breath ragged, his body shaking, his clothes dripping onto the floor. He babbled about shadows with claws, about Lillian's screams as they'd torn her apart in a roadside inn, her body shredded before his eyes, about the journal he'd sold to a cloaked figure whose laugh echoed like the wind through dead trees, whose face he never saw but whose presence lingered in his nightmares. Clara listened, her expression unreadable, pouring him tea laced with herbs not to heal but to dull his senses, to weigh his limbs with a false calm. Nightshade and hemlock ground fine into the leaves. She asked about the betrayal, her voice soft but edged with steel, a blade wrapped in silk, her eyes locked on his. Thomas sobbed, his words tumbling over each other, a flood of confession admitting he'd planned it all, winning her trust with soft lies and stolen glances, taking the journal when she slept, its weight a thrill in his hands, leaving her for Lillian, who'd promised him riches and a life beyond the road, a future of silk and gold he'd craved since boyhood. He swore he regretted it, that he loved her still, that he'd come back to make it right, to beg her mercy. But Clara saw the lie in his darting eyes, the flicker of cowardice beneath his tears, the same greed that had driven him to her doorstep months ago. The rune on her wrist burned hotter, a searing heat that spread through her veins, pulsing in time with the storm outside. And the cottage shook, lightning splitting the sky, illuminating shapes that moved among the trees, tall, twisted, too many limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. She stepped back as Thomas' words faltered, his body slumping from the tea, his eyelids fluttering, his hands twitching toward her in a final feeble plea. The windows rattled as if something massive pressed against them, the glass cracking under the strain, the air thick with a stench like wet earth and decay, a rot that clawed at her throat. Then the door burst open, not by wine, but by force. The hinges splintering, the wood shattering inward, shadows poured in, formless writhing things with eyes like embers, glowing red and unblinking, their claws scraping the floor, leaving gouges in the wood that smoked faintly. Thomas screamed, a raw animal sound that tore from his chest, clawing at the air, at the heart, at Clara's legs, his nails digging into her skirt. But the shadows seized him, their tendrils wrapping around his arms, his throat, his legs, dragging him toward the door. His body thrashed, his boots kicking uselessly, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored her own buried fear. Clara watched, her heart pounding, her breath shallow, her hands clenched into fists as his pleas turned to shrieks, high and piercing, then to a gurgling silence as the shadows pulled him into the night. The forest swallowed him. the shadows retreating with their prize, leaving only a faint echo of his terror and a smear of blood on the threshold that glistened in the firelight, pulling into the cracks of the floor like ink. But the horror didn't end with his screams, nor with the silence that followed. The spirit returned that night, its voice coiling around her dreams like ivy, tight and suffocating, a presence that pressed against her mind until she thought it would crack. It demanded more, not just Thomas' soul but hers. Piece by piece, a slow unraveling of everything she was, a feast it would savor over decades. The price of her revenge was her humanity, her sanity, her life stretched thin across years of torment until she was nothing but a vessel for its will, a hollow shell echoing with its laughter. Clara woke gasping, her wrist aflame, the rune searing her skin, and found it spreading, black veins creeping up her arm like roots burrowing into soil, branching across her chest. Her reflection in the cracked mirror showed eyes that weren't fully her own, pupils too wide, flecked with something red that pulsed with each blink. Her hands shook as she touched her face, feeling the skin tighten, the air around her buzzing with a sound she couldn't place, whispers or wings or the scrape of claws on stone. The village began to notice the change, though they couldn't name it. Her garden withered overnight, the herbs turning to ash that blew away in the wind, leaving barren patches where life had once thrived, the soil itself refusing her touch. Children swore they saw her shadow twist unnaturally in the moonlight, stretching too long, too thin, splitting into shapes that moved on their own, and they stopped playing near her cottage, their laughter replaced by hushed warnings. Travelers stopped coming, their wagons bypassing the village entirely, their faces pale as they spoke of a road that felt watched, of eyes in the trees that followed them until they crossed the river miles away. The forest grew thicker, its branches clawing at the sky, blotting out the sun, its roots snaking into the village fields, cracking wells and choking streams. The villagers whispered of a curse, their voices hushed as they locked their doors at night, their prayers growing louder in the small chapel, the priest's hands trembling as he blessed the thresholds with salt and oil. Clara felt it, the spirit's presence growing inside her, a cold weight in her chest, its hunger insatiable, gnawing at her thoughts, twisting her memories of Thomas into grotesque visions, his face melting, his hands clawing from the earth, his voice begging her to join him. She tried to fight it, burning sage until the smoke choked her, reciting old words from memory, her voice trembling as she traced salt lines across her floor, her windows, her bed, the grain scattering with each gust that slipped through the cracks. But the rune pulsed stronger, the black veins reaching her shoulder, her neck, threading toward her heart. And the voice laughed, a sound that echoed in her skull, promising she'd never be free, that she'd bound herself to it as surely as she'd bound Thomas to his fate, that her revenge was only the beginning of her suffering. Years crept by, slow and relentless, each day a battle against the thing she's unleashed. Clara became a ghost in her own life, her hair graying, falling in brittle strands that littered the floor, her skin sagging, etched with lines that deepened overnight. But she didn't age like others, time seemed to bend around her. Trapped by the bargain, her body a shell that refused to die, her breath a rasp that echoed in the empty cottage. The village emptied, its people fleeing one by one, driven out by tales of a woman who spoke to shadows, of screams echoing from the woods that no one could trace, of livestock found gutted with no tracks to follow. The forest swallowed their abandoned homes, vines curling through broken windows, roots cracking stone, moss blanketing roofs until the village was a memory erased by green and shadow. Clara stayed, tethered to her cottage by a force she couldn't name, her days a blur of silence broken only by the creak of the walls, her nights filled with the spirit's whispers, memories of Thomas, of Lillian, of her grandmother's warnings, twisted into nightmares where she clawed at her own skin to escape, her nails drawing blood that vanished into the floor. The rune spread further, black veins threading across her chest, her face, a map of her surrender, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark when she dared to look at herself. She stopped leaving the cottage, the world beyond her door, a haze of trees and mist. The forest sedge now lapping at her garden, its roots curling around the stones like fingers. One night, a hunter, brave or foolish, ventured too close to her cottage, drawn by rumors of gold hidden in the woods, a tale spun from Thomas' boast years ago. He found her sitting by a dead hearth, the fire long extinguished, the room cold as a tomb, her eyes glowing faintly with that unnatural red, her voice a mix of hers and something else low, resonant, inhuman, a sound that crawled under his skin. She told him the story of love betrayed, of a deal struck in desperation, of a revenge that devoured her soul and left her a prisoner. Her words slow and deliberate, each one heavy with regret and rage. The hunter fled, his lantern trembling in his hand, his breath fogging as he ran, but not before glimpsing the shadows that clung to her. Their forms shifting just beyond the light, their eyes tracking him through the trees, waiting with a patience that chilled his blood. He spread the tale, his voice shaking in every tavern he reached, his hands clutching a tankard to steady them, and it became legend. Clara, the woman who loved, lost, and paid with everything, a name whispered only in fear, a story told to keep children from the woods. The cottage stands empty now, or so they say, swallowed by the forest, its stones crumbling under vines that pulse faintly, as if alive, their tips burrowing into the earth like roots seeking water. But some claim she's still there, a figure glimpsed in the trees, her room glowing in the dark like a beacon, a sickly light that draws moths and repels all else. Her voice carried on the wind, sometimes a plea for release, sometimes a warning to turn back, sometimes a laugh that freezes the marrow and sends birds scattering from the canopy. The forest keeps her, a prisoner of her own vengeance, her soul frayed and bound to the spirit she summoned, its presence a shadow that stretches beyond her, touching the world in ways she never foresaw. Hunters avoid the woods now, their dogs whimpering at the border, refusing to cross, their ears flat with fear, and children dare each other to step past the first tree, though none go far, their bravado fading when the wind shifts and carries a sound too close to a scream. The village is a memory, its name lost to time, erased from maps and tales, its people scattered to distant towns where they speak of it only in hushed tones, their eyes darting to the horizon. Clara endures, or what's left of her does, a shadow among shadows. A life traded for hate, her body a husk that moves through the trees, her mind a battlefield where she fights the spirit's will, losing ground with each passing year. The ruin covers her now, black veins threading across her face, her arms, her chest, a lattice that glows faintly when the moon hides, a mark of ownership she can't erase. She sees Thomas sometimes, or thinks she does, his face in the mist, his hands reaching from the soil, his voice begging her to join him, to end it, but she knows it's the spirit's trick, a lure to pull her deeper into its grasp. The forest has grown vast, swallowing miles beyond the village, its borders unmarked, its heart a place no map can chart, and those who enter don't return, their fates whispered in tavern tales, lost to the trees, to the shadows, to her, and deep within those woods, where no light dares linger, where the air haunts with a hunger older than the world, where the ground pulses with a rhythm no one can name, the shadows wait, patient and eternal, their eyes unblinking, their claws poised, hungry for the next soul to stumble into their grasp. Their whispers a promise that some debts can never be paid, that some bargains bind forever. Clara remains, a relic of her own making, a warning carved into the silence, her story a thread in the forest's endless tapestry of loss and wrath, a tale that ends not with peace, but with the slow, inevitable unraveling of all she once was, swallowed by the dark she called her own.